students from Complutense University. I am Sotelo, coordinator of Eurasia Foundation course at Burgos University, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. So today's lecture, Critical Thinking Skills to Overcome Fake News, Prejudice and Misconceptions in Cross-Cultural Dialogues when Asia Community with Europe, will be divided in two parts. First, it will be a more theoretical approach, followed by a more practical one, even though there will be practical activities in both sections. To briefly introduce myself, I am the coordinator of One Asia Burgos University 2020 course. We have organized a course along the lines of sustainability, ethics, and social responsibility in cross-cultural dialogues, One Asia Community with Europe. Ethics and social responsibility in cross-cultural dialogues has always been a very important research line, both professionally and personally. I hold a PhD on cultural and literary studies in English-spoken countries by Complutense University of Madrid. I am also a professor in this university where I teach cultural and literary studies courses in the English Studies department. I am also the Interculturality and Social Innovation Coordinator of a research group called Studies on Intermediality and Intercultural Mediation. One of our research lines is to promote ethics and social responsibility in cross-cultural dialogues. As an example, I've been working on specifically the context of the European Union in a project called New Narratives for Europe, Social and Science and Humanities, Critical Thinking and Responsible Research and Innovation. This has been a research project involving university students in providing critical thinking narratives to construct a new Europe. I have also coordinated transmedia stories of social intervention in which students from different degrees they had to use their critical thinking minds to come up with creative solutions to problems in their communities by using their specific knowledge of degrees and fields of study. In the specific area of education, especially higher education, to be a critical thinker and to have a critical thinking mind is considered a requirement to achieve successful learning outcomes. Just to give you a little summary in relation to the European Union context, since 1999, the Bologna Declaration provided a complete change in methodology in European universities. It not only provided a network of mobility and equaling credits of different degrees, so students could convalidate their studies and easily work in any of the European country members. Mostly, the Bologna Declaration implies a change in methodology, an unprecedented change in methodology, because students are no longer passive bearers of information. They are required to have an active role in the classroom. As the Bologna Declaration evolved into the establishment of the European higher education era that was established in 2010, and as it is reflected in the Budapest-Vienna Declaration, institutions should ensure that the programs are delivered in a way that encourages the students to take an active role, and these institutions need to foster student-centered learning. So students are now the protagonists of their own learning. All this is framed into a competence-based education. Competences are considered to be the knowledge and the skills and also the attitudes that students must acquire during the different educational stages. These are requirements that will help the learners to find fulfillment later in life and find work and take part in a society. Within these competences, there are key competences and also what they're called transversal or horizontal skills, which are applied to all the competences. One of these transversal skills is critical thinking. Critical thinking is considered a transversal competence because it is included in all the 8 key competences That means that critical thinking, it's important to become a literate person, it's important to acquire linguistic competence, it's important to acquire scientific, technological, mathematical competence, also to acquire digital competence, also to improve personal, social, and learning skills. Of course, critical thinking is important for civic competence, democratic participation, values, sustainability. Also, it's important for entrepreneurship because problem solving is an aspect of critical thinking. And of course, it's important to cultural awareness and expression. And this is one of the points where this unites with the line of my topic today: how to promote critical thinking skills in cultural awareness to fight against hate, prejudice, and fake news. To sum up, critical thinking in education means that nowadays, in a European context, we have a competence-based education, and critical thinking is a transversal competence that is reflected in all official curriculums and teaching guides, from early childhood education to university degrees. The objectives of all university degrees must reflect this competence. To give you an example, in one of the subjects I teach, subject literature of the United States until 1850s, in the objectives of the course, students must able to locate, students must able to evaluate the content of the course, students must be able to articulate their own critical readings. So students are supposed to be critical thinkers. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a critical thinker? What does it mean that students have to effectively discuss? What does it mean that students critically analyze, evaluate, argue? I ask these questions to my students after I explain the teaching guide, and over the years, I've been amazed at the lack of responses and also the lack of understanding of what critical thinking is. This, applied to cross-cultural dialogues, is an important factor to bear in mind, because how are we going to promote critical thinking debates if we don't know exactly what is to be a critical thinker in cross-cultural dialogues? So I would like you to just reflect for a minute. How would you be able to articulate or to explain what you as a student have to do when you are supposed to effectively discuss, or when you are supposed to effectively analyze or evaluate something? This is one of the reasons I ask you to please fill in the questionnaire about critical thinking skills. I thank you very much for those of you who have participated in this. And the reason why I ask you to do that is just because of what I just explained, that critical thinking, it's a very important competence in education since early childhood. And when students get to university degrees, they are supposed to have mastered these skills. Surprisingly enough, during my experience as a university teacher, the performance in the classroom, it portrays a different picture. And just recently, I started to pass this survey to provide evidence of this lack of training at a university level. This is out of an example of the responses I've got so far. Out of 226 responses to the question, has any other teacher taught you what critical thinking skills are? Well, 61% of the students have answered that no. At a university level, no other teacher had told them what critical thinking skills were. When I ask, when did you learn about critical thinking skills? Well, 43% say that it's at university, meaning that no, they have not learned it at any other earlier stage. And 26% affirm that they've never learned about critical thinking skills at university level, which is very, very striking. You can see here some of that this survey is intended to be as interdisciplinary as possible for students from physiotherapy, primary education degrees, excellence, business, nursing, journalism, audiovisual communication, fine arts and design. So I intend to provide a broad range of profiles to back up this survey. So these results are problematic, not only because they reflect an overwhelming lack of basic academic skills at university level, but also because the only way to fight against fake news and disinformation, one of the biggest threats in the digital era, and not only in social networks and social media, but also in mainstream media, is to have a critical mindset and to provide a critical approach to all the information that comes across. I have to confess that for many years I've been very much troubled about the fact that students are not learning these critical thinking skills and earlier ages of education, meaning secondary, primary. But I don't believe in blaming. I believe in finding solutions to problems. And what I'm going to present to you now, it's my contribution to trying to find a solution to this problem in the university classroom, at least in the Spanish university classroom. This is a project in collaboration with my colleague Matthias Prietza, and it is framed within the research group that I mentioned to you about, studies on intermediality and intercultural mediation in Complutense University. It's also an awareness and an acknowledgement that we cannot ask students to do something that we have not already taught them. And so this is intended to be a very practical mini basic interdisciplinary tool on how to teach critical thinking skills at a university level. So as I told you before, the first problem I detected in the classroom was that when I asked students when they presented an oral project or in a written essay, why have you chosen this topic? Well, what do you think? I'm asking you right now. What do you think they answered to me? Well, yeah, what they tend to answer to me is because I like it. So this is problematic because they're not saying anything. And when I tell the students, well, you're not explaining anything, sometimes they say, yes, well, I'm using because. That's a way to provide a reason. And that's another thing that we need to reflect about. The fact that we are saying because, that's not a guarantee that we're actually providing a reason. This is also coupled with an overwhelming lack of originality and personal voice at university level. Also, it's framed within the culture of the copy-paste. And this is the Wikipedia age in which a lot of sources are not contrasted and students don't even detect the problem of reliability. So these were my main recurrent problems that I've been encountering over the years. I came across, luckily, in 2014, a very practical manual called Critical Thinking in the Language Classroom, and this has provided a lot of inspiration to tailor and customize activities for university students. Here, I would like to pause for a second, and I would like to ask you, the same as I asked before as a student, what is, from your point of view, to be a critical thinker? What is to have an opinion from your point of view? And how would you define critical thinking? If you were asked to provide a definition, what would you be your definition? And here, I am sure that if I collected your responses, I will get many very good approaches, and they will all add to the growing picture of what critical thinking is. And I say growing picture because in recent years, critical thinking has become somehow a buzzword, a very popular word in the world of education, in the world of teaching, and a lot of different approaches to the definition have been provided over the years. It is true that critical thinking is not an easy concept, that it can be reduced or defined in simple terms. And that is something that we need to take into account in order to understand what is to be a critical thinker. If we look at the origins of the term, very briefly, the term critical thinking first started emerging in academic circles in literature in the mid 20th century. It is in 1941 where the academic Edward Glaser stressed that critical thinking referred to the search for evidence to support or discredit a belief or an argument. However, even before Glaser used the term, critical thinking is being embedded in human thought throughout history. We can go back to the Greek philosopher Socrates, who proposed a system of inquiry which set out to question everyday beliefs to arrive at the truth on the basis of real evidence. So Socratic questioning is still very much known today, but again, is the same as critical thinking. It really there is no consensual definition, not even at academic level or professional level, in which to all agree on what critical thinking is and to provide the basic and the simplest definition for all to consensuate. It is in 1956 where a committee of educators chaired by the educational psychologist Benjamin Bloom worked towards developing a system of thinking that would go beyond traditional learning in education and encourage higher order thinking. So the idea of acquiring a higher order thinking is very much credited to Bloom and his taxonomy. That it's a concept that is actually being redefined and adopted over the years. It's really considered a canon in academia to understand the steps towards achieving a critical thinking mentality. Here we have that, as I mentioned before, it has provided, it has evolved since the first articulation of its taxonomy in the 1950s till very recent in the 21. The different elements of Bloom taxonomy can be visually understood as different sub-skills, different steps to be taken in order to achieve critical thinking. So this image of a stairway case I think is visually descriptive and helpful to understand that critical thinking is formed by different sub-skills that you need to be taken in order to achieve this higher order thinking. At the basic level of the staircase, it is understanding. And understanding in the level of the classroom, the university classroom, is understanding a specific content, and then the teacher might need to ask questions such as what kind of test it is it from a newspaper, where would you read it? Then it is the level of applying. And applying is when after you have learned something, you apply it. For example, if you've learned about past simple verbs, then you do an activity and you apply the past simple verbs, or the same with any other university content. These are the two basic steps to be taken to be a critical thinker. And sadly, it seems that the educational system, it's not just going farther these two, because really when we start getting into the higher order thinking is when we get to the analyzing. And this is the stage where we turn to the text and we start to question how the writer's information is presented. For example, the students might have found information in the test, but then they want to find evidence to support the main points. This analyzing often involves identifying how a text or its arguments are constructed. So this is the stage in where students are becoming to be more critical about the text and just not accepting information at face value. Another step is evaluating, and this is really the key of a higher order critical thinking skill. This is a stage in which students have isolated the writer's arguments and views, and they start to evaluate the validity and relevance of the information. This could involve asking students to assess how much the test is fact supported by evidence or how much is biased, how much is the opinion of the writer. This has to do with reliability. And once you are able to understand, apply, analyze, and evaluate, that's when you're able to create. And this create as a critical thinker, it's a very multifolded concept because it depends what area you are creating. But again, within the academic context, created means that you are able to articulate your arguments based on what you have read, based on what you have detected is false, it's flaw, and you are able to provide your own argumentation. So just to have a practical approach and to see if you really understand what is to be a critical thinker in its basic stages, I'm going to provide a practical activity. And in this activity, I'm going to give you a statement. I want you to please reflect about it. What is your opinion about this? And if you agree and disagree. Then I will give you a number of responses to choose from, and then I'll give you my interpretation. So let's start. The statement I would like you to think about is the new name for the foundation, Eurasia, will strengthen the establishment of one Asia community in relation with Europe. So what's your opinion? Do you agree? Do you agree that Eurasia it's a concept that will help strengthen cross-cultural relations? So now I ask you to please choose what is the closest to your opinion. And of course, I understand that maybe in a real life conversation, these sentences will be developed. But for the purpose of the activity, I would like you to please choose the one that is closest to your response, knowing that that's what it said. There is no more to add. So the first answer is, I'm not interested in this topic. The second answer, I agree, is true. The third, I disagree, is false. The fourth, I'm not sure. The five, I agree up to a point, but I also disagree. 6, I agree or disagree because. And 7, I agree or disagree for a number of reasons, but I also like more evidence. So again, please think for a second and which one of these is the closest to your opinion. So now I am going to provide interpretation. When people choose number 1, I'm not interested in this topic, it is important that you understand that you need to answer to what you are asked. You were not asked if you were interested or not interested in this. What you was asked was your opinion. So we need to reflect how a lot of times people just answer things that they have nothing to do with the question. Number 2 and number 3, I agree is true, I disagree is false. These are responses associated with people with a very strong opinion, which is good, But as a critical thinker, we need to provide reasons for our opinion. We need to justify our opinion. Number 4, I'm not sure, and number 5, I agree up to a point, but I also disagree. This could be considered safe responses from people who are very diplomatic. You want to say you want to agree with one person and you want to agree with the other person, but it's important that as critical thinkers, we need to take a stand, we need to position ourselves, and we need to be active in the discussion. And that's what I'm saying with this, is that it is possible that you agree with someone and you disagree with someone at the same time, but you have to give reasons of why you agree and why you disagree. Critical thinkers, again, provide reasons. To those who are those who've chosen number 6, I agree and I disagree because this is good. This is the first step to become a critical thinker, because you want to provide a reason for your opinion. However, number 7, it's even better, because critical thinkers know that they would not give an answer if they are not sure. They want to have the evidence to support their answer. So that's why this would be the closest to be a critical thinker. So as we can see, at a basic level, to be a critical thinker is to be able to provide justification and reason for your opinion. Here I would like you to stop for a second and reflect. What kind of opinion are we talking about? Is it personal opinion? Is it objective opinion? Do we really have an opinion? For example, when we talk about politics, do we really have an opinion about politics because we have contrasted or searched or read their political program? Or is it that it's just things that we hear on TV, on the news, and we make it as ours, as if it were our opinion? Do we think about political party? Do we support a political party because it's our own choice, or because our familiar surrounders, our relatives follow that political party? The same applies, for example, to football teams. Do you follow your football team because it's your own choice, or because it's what you've seen in your family? Or do you follow that football team because you want to rebel against your family, so you choose a completely different one? All I'm saying is that sometimes when we support teams or political parties as the best one, we don't really look for the evidence, which is the only reliable and objective criteria to know which one is the best. The same when you talk about football teams. The only best football team would be the one that gets more cups, more trophies, more leagues, right? Basically, the main distinction that I would like to make here is between personal opinion, the opinion that we have with our friends and family, and the one that we have in an academic context, or the one that reflects about society, issues that have their scope is beyond our personal surroundings. And of course, when we talk about academic critical thinking, which is what I am focusing on, to be cross-cultural thinkers in the future, first you have to be a critical thinker as a student. I would like to please reflect about the fact that it is important to have a personal opinion, of course, but not in academic or when it talks about society debates. To guarantee that we express a critical thinking statement or affirmation, one way to explain this also in a practical way is through language structures, because we express our opinion through linguistic structures. So one way to guarantee that we're being critical thinkers is by acknowledging these language structures and always provide a justification. For example, when you give an opinion about Eurasia Foundation name as a name that will strengthen the cross relations between Europe and Asia, you will be a critical thinker if you use statements such as, I think the Eurasian name is a good name because, or I believe is a good name because, or from my point of view, as far as I'm concerned, if you ask me, or I agree is a good name, or I disagree is a good name because. And then you justify why. This is a way to guarantee that we are articulating a point of view that is justified. It may sound a little bit repetitive, but that's how we learn in life, through repetition, in a way that we internalize these structures. And every time we express our opinion, we use it this way that guarantees justification. Also, from a humanistic point of view, I would like to stress that I look at these language structures as a way not only to provide objective, contrasted opinion, but it is a way to allow for respectfulness and to respect diversity of opinions. Why? Because when you acknowledge, I think, I believe, from my point of view, you are recognizing that it's just your view, that it doesn't have to be the ultimate or the truth. It is just your view, which it means that there are different views too. So by using these language structures, you're also promoting respect in other points of view. Finally, to understand what is a contrasted opinion at a basic level, we need to oppose it to a subjective opinion. A subjective opinion does not have to be based on any evidence. However, contrasted opinion has to be contrasted. It's an information that must be contrasted, and it only can be contrasted through evidence in order to know what is true. So this idea of contrasted opinion is very important to understand what is to be a critical thinker. I would also like to point at just two more ways to, as language structures, to trigger critical thinking. One way will be the difference between closed questions, ended questions, and open questions. When we use closed questions, the answer is yes or no, which doesn't allow for justification or more explanation. For example, when you say, do you think Eurasia is a better name for One Asia Foundation? The answer to that question is only yes or no. It doesn't allow for a more development of the justification. The same with the following questions. Is sustainability a common challenge in Europe and Asia? Yes or no is the only answer to that question. Is it important that people recycle more than they do? Are ethics and human rights understood in the same way in Europe and Asia? That the way that those questions are framed as closed questions, that doesn't allow for more reasoned conversation. The same with the question, is the world now with coronavirus crisis a more dangerous place than 50 years ago? The answer to that does not allow for evidence to back up the answer. However, if we use open questions, the open questions use WH questions such as what, why, who, when, where, or then the answer necessarily needs to be developed. So when you ask, where did you read that sustainability is a common challenge in Europe and Asia? The answer must provide justification. When you ask, what evidence is that ethics and human rights are understood in the same way in Europe and Asia? You need to provide evidence. You need to provide justification. So, articulating open questions, especially in cross-cultural dialogues, allows for a contrasted reasoning in our answers, not just answers driven by personal opinion, which is what we need to avoid in order to have a serious conversation. Because all these different basic points that I am covering, it's intended to provide the basic tools that we need to have in order to have a conversation that is objective and that is not driven by any prejudice or bias. It is just based on evidence. Another point that is important to be a critical thinker and to understand the sub-skill of analyzing and evaluating that is prior to the creation that we saw in the staircase is the reflection on the reliability of sources. Nowadays, due to the fake news situation, there are a growing emerging new platforms, as I will tell you later, in the European context, that put a lot of stress on the need to the citizens to verify themselves. However, the fact that you are promoting verification, it takes for granted that people know what reliable and verifiable sources are. And that's why I've included this section in the toolkit, because it is important to understand what reliability means in order to be able to evaluate efficiently the sources and the information that it comes across. So, as a practical activity to understand what is reliability, here I also present an activity. Imagine I ask you to write an essay about cultural differences between Europe and Asia. And here I'll ask you to stop for a second and to question what are the sources that you would use that you use when you are asked to write an essay. Where would you look for information? So the same that I did before about understanding the basic state that is to provide reason, and this reason is constructive, by giving you a set of answers and an interpretation. Here, I'm also going to give you a scale, and I ask you to please evaluate from your point of view from the more to the least reliable source. With a 1 will be a not reliable source, with a 2 will be maybe a credible source of information, and 3, it's a very credible source of information. So let's start with the first example. A documentary about cultural differences on TV with interviews with real people. How much do you consider TV programs reliable? And what are the TV channels that you would qualify as reliable? This is an interesting activity, and I know that you are not sharing the answers right now, but in my experience, it's striking to see that there is not really a consensus. Some people consider that TV is not really reliable anymore, and here and some others do point at some TV channels that are considered reliable based on a trajectory of experts and Pulitzer Prizes. For example, this is important that we as teachers and students negotiate within our subjects. I usually negotiate that programs from National Geographic would be considered a reliable source of information. However, the proliferation of digital channels due to these digital scenarios implies that a lot of these channels do not really have a very fine filter in a lot of these programs. So here I would say that your answers would vary, but that's exactly problematic. The fact that some of us are not considering TV reliable. And this is what we need to find a consensus. What are the sources that we can use and which cannot be used? Moving on to the second one, journalists writing an article in a newspaper. Do you consider newspaper articles reliable? And again, I'm sure here you will have different answers, which again is problematic that we do not overwhelmingly agree the newspapers are reliable sources of information. We have many examples, such as Fox News, that has been sued repeatedly by demonstrating that the news are biased and manipulated. And in the situation of Spain, for example, we need to understand that the digital turn has changed the whole scenario in the mainstream media, because a lot of newspapers are now digital, and people do not buy printed newspapers, and a lot of these newspapers are going bankrupt. There is no, also on the other hand, there is no there is no law of media in Spain right now regulating this. And as I will show you, there is two examples of reliable sources and fact-checking sources, but in general, there is no certified filter of fact-checking when it comes to newspapers, which is very, very problematic if we cannot even trust our newspapers. Then, members of your own family. Would you use members of your own family as reliable sources for written essay? Maybe here some of you would automatically say no, but I will ask you to reflect what happens if any of your relatives is an expert on the field. Maybe it's a university professor, maybe it's a well-known researcher. So again, these assumptions are due to the digital context in which the boundaries are no longer clear anymore. It's important to have this conversation. What things are reliable and which things are not. In the case of an infographic on Facebook, I think we can all agree that using Facebook material on an academic paper would not be reliable, at least at this point. Maybe in the future there is an academic filter. The same with Wikipedia, as we're going to see in point 7. Okay, moving on to number 5. What do you think about a YouTube video? Would you consider that reliable? Maybe some of you would automatically say no. But now, more and more well-known universities and renowned experts are using their own YouTube channels to publicize their works. So it's not so much the format YouTube, but who is behind the link that we're watching. Then number 6, a published book by a qualified specialist on the subject. I guess here is the safest response to a reliable, because a qualified specialist must have to go through the filter of academia, publishing a PhD and doing research, publishing in journals. All that goes through peer review process, and it's really a filter of fact-checking. An entry in Wikipedia, Wikipedia till this point is not a reliable source. This is also problematic because of the widespread use of Wikipedia in academic circles. I am myself teaching students in the Master of Education, future teachers, and a lot of teachers do use Wikipedia. Wikipedia, again, right now we're in a transition in which if the page that you are consulting has reliable sources that you can track, I would say that you can use it. But for the most part, Wikipedia does not have a tracking of sources, and that is problematic, and that's not academic. So we have to be careful with Wikipedia. A survey about cultural differences in a weekly magazine. This is not a reliable source, because here you have to look at the difference between a journal, which is academic and goes through a peer revision and it goes through a filter, than a magazine. A magazine is not necessarily academic, and nowadays, due to the easy audiovisual production of smart computers, and every average person can become a journalist now through these accessible tools. It is problematic not to have an academic filter through a magazine. So it shouldn't be a source for academic work. Well, with this activity, I wanted to make you reflect about the veracity and the credibility of the sources that we use. That is, we need to have in the academia consensus on what is reliable and what's not. The whole digital scenario has blurred boundaries, and still there hasn't have a serious conversation between experts, academics, and even at professional level, or what are the credible sources and which ones are not. And this was an activity to visualize that these boundaries are not longer clear, and it's necessary to consensuate with teachers before handing an academic work. Okay, so we're almost done. I would like to just stop for a second to see if you are following, and I will do a little bit of revision time to understand the approach to critical thinking as a basics to have a serious cross-cultural conversation. So critical thinking is expressed through language structures, and what is expressed is an opinion, but this opinion is not subjective. It has to be contrasted opinion, and it is contrasted because it is the opposite of a subjective, and it is because it's based on facts and evidence. It comes from credible, reliable sources, and it's contrasted because it means that it's checked twice. We also look at critical thinking from a humanistic point of view, in the point of view of values and respect and tolerance to diversity, because when we are aware of these language structures of critical thinking, we respect other people's opinions and we don't impose our point of view. So just to finish this theoretical part of critical thinking, the last point I would like to reflect with you that it's related to critical thinking is plagiarism. Please have a look at this graduation photo and reflect a little bit what this means. This is a graduation speech in which students are thanking the internet, Google, Wikipedia, Microsoft Word, and copy-paste. Of course, it's an ironic portrayal of a university performance, but I also think it's, in my own experience as a teacher, and I told you before, this lack of academic voice and this copy-paste culture, I think is also very sadly reflects the reality of graduation at universities today, universities in Europe at least. So, plagiarism, again, would like to have a practical approach to plagiarism and to reflect what it means. And yeah, again, the same with critical thinking. What would it be your answer if you were asked to define plagiarism? I won't go into literature on plagiarism, but I think we can all agree that to plagiarize is to credit for something that is not yours. And over the years, trying to find a practical way to understand and to prevent plagiarism, I've come with this formula that I call anti-plagiarism mantra that I'm going to share with you through a practical approach. And this mantra is based on three basic ideas. To avoid plagiarism, you have to quote, you have to cite, you have to reference. Quote, cite, and reference. As we're going to see in examples, not necessarily have to be all the three at once. If you're not literally quoting, you just can only cite and reference. But these are the three important elements, and sometimes there are the three included, or sometimes there are two. Let's have a look at activities to see if you understand. So these are taken from students' responses over the years, and I use their responses to reflect on this. And I ask you to tell me if what I am going to read, is it okay? And if it's not, why? So I was preparing my presentation and I took some information from an online website. I rephrased it using my own words. I didn't say where I had taken it from in my presentation. So reflect for a minute if it's okay and why. Maybe some of you, so let's see. Let's start. I was preparing my presentation and I took. When you assuming and you affirm that you taking something, it's taken from somebody. Nothing, it's every statement, even on the internet, is written by somebody. So the fact that you're taken necessarily means that you have to provide reference, because to take is not necessarily bad. We all take things. What it's bad is that you don't reference or credit your source. So if you take something, you have to provide the reference. Here it says, I rephrased it. Some people believe that to rephrase is okay, but to rephrase is not okay. Because to rephrase is to take somebody's ideas and to change something. But bottom line, the idea is not yours, it's somebody else's. So to rephrase is necessarily accompanied by citing or quoting. If you rephrase, maybe you don't need to put between commas, which is to quote, but you need to cite the page number where you're taking that reference. So this is plagiarism because has taken something and has not provided reference, and has rephrased something and has not provided reference. In the second one, I copied parts of a test I found online into my own assignment. What's online belongs to everybody anyway. Besides, I don't know where the website was written by. This is one of the highlights of the answers from my students because without getting into any judgments, it really is indicative of a broader mentality. The fact that students believe that because it's on the internet belongs to everybody. And no, what it's on the internet has been written by someone. So this is wrong. Everything has to be credited. And the fact that you don't know what the website was written by, sometimes that is a result of using sources that they do not provide the references. So in a way, it's all a circle. If you take information from a page that has not been referenced, you are not going to be able to reference either. This is another example. It says, I took some tests from a source and replaced two words with synonyms. I said what my source was. So here, again, you're using replacement, which is rephrase. You paraphrase something. Here you said that you said what your source was, but to replace is not only to say what your source, is to provide the page number where you're taking the information that you replaced. Because to reference is to providing the bibliography on the work cited. But sometimes we consult books. And so in order to make a distinction between the books we consult and the ones we take in literally information from, it's necessary that we cite here what would you have taken. And then apart from citing, you need to provide the source. This is an example that says, I use an infographic I found on website. I didn't include the source, but I didn't claim it was mine. So sometimes this is another mentality I've come across from students. I didn't claim it was mine. Yes, but the fact that you did not claim it was yours does not mean that whatever resource you're using in an academic context, you have to provide reference. So of course, this is also plagiarism. Finally, this is a situation that sometimes also happens quite often, in which students say that I use my assignment in two different subjects. It is mine, so there is no problem to submit the same work for two courses. Some students think that the fact that the work is yours, you can present it as many times as you want to, and that's not plagiarism. And that's not true. Because actually, if you look at the teaching guide of any subject, every work that you submit must be original. First of all, it has to be original, and you can provide the same work, but you have to cite and you have to reference yourself. The same happens when you write an academic paper. You can include parts from other papers that you've written before, but you have to provide the reference. Otherwise, yes, you are plagiarizing yourself. So This was the last point in the basic toolkit for critical thinking skills that we are currently elaborating. This toolkit is included in a new project that we are developing in SIM, Studies on Intermediality and Intercultural Mediation. This line is called Transferable Skills for Students and Early Career Researchers. And we want to develop this toolkit as a way to trigger a consensual definition, a basic consensual definition of what critical thinking skills are at a European level. We will also like to share this manual with as many European universities as possible and ask them to co-create this manual with us through a new methodological approach, which favors open access knowledge. So we want to make this toolkit accessible to students, researchers, teachers, so they can use it and they can co-create it and provide feedback to improve it. So we are in the earliest stages of this co-creation process. The toolkit will be published at the end of June this year. So you will be able to access this manual in this website in the near future. Now, giving you a particular example of how critical thinking is being implemented at a European level to fight against fake news. This is a new project that it was launched a few years ago in 2018 by different European country members. It's called Tackling Online Disinformation. And the main objective is to avoid exposure of citizens to large-scale disinformation, including misleading or false information. It is considered and acknowledged that is a major challenge for Europe. So the European Commission is working to implement a clear and comprehensive set of actions to tackle the spread of online disinformation, because it really is understood to be a clear threat and challenge to the protection of European values and democratic systems. European Union is definitely in crisis of identity, in crisis of values, and more than ever, it's necessary that the future generations, students, and the current generations have a critical and a contrastive and objective opinion about the future of Europe in order to make the best decisions about its future. So this is an preliminary project which looks for best practices. Here you can see an overview of how this joint and coordinated action against disinformation has been evolving since 2015 and very recently in the last year, 2019. There are been some initiatives as the European Media Literacy Week, and there is implementation of cooperation networks when it comes from elections, to cover elections, to ensure fair European elections, and to avoid misinformation through the social media. So there is also an observatory right now, and different alert systems that are implemented. As a report, you can access the communication tackling online disinformation, a European approach. It's actually available in different languages, and here you will see the key principles and objectives in this platform and the line of actions that the European Commission is implemented. And also, you can check the fact-checking survey of Eurobarometer which is an opinion poll covering 28 member states, as reliable sources for tackling disinformation. Now, just to finish with this part, I would like to give you a particular example of how critical thinking is promoted in Spanish media through two new initiatives. One is called Neutral. It's audiovisual content startup that it was founded in January 2018 by a journalist in Spain. It's called Ana Pastor. And it's organized around three main areas: the production of television programs and new narratives on social networks, and especially this new innovation fact-checking section that stresses the need to fact checks and to avoid fakes by verification. So that's what we call a verification zone. So it's intended to be a platform of journalists, engineers, researchers, programmers, producers, filmmakers, graphic artists, documentary filmmakers that are joining forces to provide solid data and the information that it's available on their websites and TV program. There is, in this verification section, it's just focused on identifying the fake news. So it's a very important section of this website. Also, along with Neutral, in Spain we have Maldita, a newspaper. And just only in Spain, apart from Neutral, this newspaper is the only ones that are signatory of a code, an international code of verification tests that able to identify and expose false information in networks. For example, just in the coronavirus situation that we're living currently in Spain, this platform has identified 324 fake news around the coronavirus. So what's important about these two media platforms in relation to critical thinking is that they are vocalizing the need to verify information. They need to the citizens to be critical thinkers, and they are asking to contrast information. What's important in terms of education is that as long as students or professionals know beforehand what is to verify, what is to distinguish between a reliable information and non-reliable information, this somehow does not really help to educate people. It allows people to identify fake news by providing extra sources to back up their news, but it doesn't really provide the tools to the citizens to become critical thinkers. This is why these newspapers are important, but at the same time, they're not enough to fight against fake news. What is important is that we as citizens develop these basic critical thinking skills that I mentioned before, to always provide contrasted information, to always ask for verification, to always ask for the source. And that's the only way we can have a serious conversation, when we provide sources and we demand contrasted sources from others. So these two newspapers are helping to fight fake news in Spain, but are just one complementary way to fight that. We need education. We need to have a consensual definition of what is fake news in order to be able to fight against the disinformation and spreading. Just to finish, I would like to highlight that this new critical thinking media, as I would like to call her, it's identified through an international signatory sealed, and this is a code. This seal signifies that you are part of a code of principles of an international fact-checking network, and is based on non-partisan and transparent fact-checking. If IFCN is an organization that is committed to excellence in journalism verification processes that oversees worldwide, that the teams are dedicated to do this in compliance with a series of ethical principles, guarantees impartiality and professionalism in their news. So I would like you to now try to identify this signatory seal in the media that you consult. There are currently 53 news agencies that have signed this verified code of principles. And in Spain, as I was saying, only Neutral and Maldita newspaper are part of this critical thinking network of media. So this is the end of this theoretical part, in which I hope you have found it useful, this mini manual in which I'm trying to promote a consensual and basic definition and understanding of what to be a critical thinker and to have a critical mentality means. This basic definition, it boils down to having a contrasted opinion that is objective, and as objective must be based on evidence and facts, and is coming from reliable sources of information. So this is the end of the theoretical part. I hope you have found it useful, and if you would like to provide any comments or suggestions to improve this definition in progress, please contact us, and you can be part of our project on transferable skills. And here you have some literature on critical thinking for those who are interested. So let's move now to the next part, a more critical approach of critical thinking skills to avoid prejudice and misconceptions in cross-cultural dialogues, especially one Asia community with Europe. The intention of a practical approach is to put into practice this working definition of critical thinking as contrasted opinion based on evidence and facts and coming from reliable sources of information, especially in the context of cross-cultural dialogues. So, as I started before with the definition of critical thinking, let's not assume that we all in an intercultural context agree on what values such as respect and tolerance mean. And with that perspective, it's important to ask to ourselves how to promote respectful and tolerant cross-cultural dialogues if we do not agree on the meaning of respect and tolerance. So thinking about values from a critical thinking standpoint, I came across the work of Charlie De Ciantis and Kenton Hyand. They both live and work in the United States. A few years ago, I encountered a wonderful book that I highly recommend that is called What's Important? Understanding and Working with Values Perspective. And it really gave me a different insight into understanding values in an intercultural context in a very reasoned and contrasted way. Both of them, they have co-written the book, and they are the co-authors of the Values Perspective Theory and Survey that I will briefly introduce to you. They both coach and they train and they consult using this values perspective, which is a theory and a practice that is supported by their online survey, but also by a long trajectory on research and literature about it. And this values perspective is very interesting because it's approaches values and human interactions in a non-judgmental way, and their work with individuals, with teams, and organizations is always conducted in a manner that ensures confidentiality and creates a safe space for understanding values, oneself and those of others. Is interesting about their perspective and how they explain how values work is that they look at values not just as fixed categories of meaning, but as packets of energy that are usually identified by a single word or phrase, and they are represented by behaviors. And so when we perceive and use values language, we trigger an energy in ourselves and in others. Sometimes this energy is positive in its nature, and sometimes it's negative. And when it's positive, we usually call that motivation, solidarity, community, and it really triggers a really good feeling in ourselves. But when it's negative, we usually call that disrespect, hate, and it's associated with hard feelings in our heart. Either way, it could be a surprisingly powerful approach to values that I encourage you to discover. Then, the second way to look at values is that they look at values as choices. So, we can choose our values. And this is really intended to destabilize this rigid mentality that values are stable and they are homogeneous when it comes to cultures, meaning that all people from one culture share the same values. And the opposite means that people from different cultures don't share our values. And so this is an important approach to destabilize and deconstruct this mentality. Values as choices are meaning that it's not like the genetic information that we are born with. Values are not genetic information. We are taught values. We are taught what is important, what matters, how to behave to support those principles and values. But it's important to observe that when we find ourselves in new environments, we often modify not only how we behave, but also might change the priority that we value. We see this when we compare, for example, our private lives with our working lives. And this is not to say that we lack integrity by shifting our values at work, only that we just choose to prioritize different values depending on the situations we experience. This is an important perspective because it provides flexibility in the way we look at values. So, understanding that values are choices is acknowledging that we successfully accommodate changes because values can be intentionally selected and prioritized. Actually, through the work that I'm presenting to you, these are they show in their value perspective that they are thousands of human values. And interestingly enough, we just tend to choose and to focus on a few. The next point that they present about how values work is that they look at values as clusters of meaning. So values link together to mean meaning. People simply do not just hold one value at a time. And any given value naturally links and connects to another. Solidarity connects to community, to trust. These values may be grouped and linked in a variety of ways. But it's important to observe how one value always associates with others. These groupings of linkages may be determined by themes, and also in the case of intercultural dialogues, it can be grouped by worldviews perspectives. Also, another important point is that they show how we define our values in a different way. So the meaning of a value like honesty can seem very obviously simple to us, and we're often surprised to find that other people, when we look at intercultural dialogues, we're surprised that people can define this value in a different way, and also can behave differently to support it. And this, of course, is very, very obvious when it comes to some political performances of people who, who say something and act in a different way. And finally, another important perspective that they propose, that is contrasted. All these approaches are backed up with a very long trajectory, as I told you, and very solid research. So finally, as I was saying, valuing something, a value, does not necessarily mean that we can do a value, but we can practice. Let me explain this. For example, values motivate our behavior, but they don't guarantee skills or competences. So, for example, when we look at stability, financial stability, as an important value of finding balance in our life, right? However, if we look at the educational system, we're not given the skills unless you train yourself specifically. So it's an important value. It can actually be a core value for a lot of people. However, we don't necessarily skill or our competence in that value, but we can have the aspiration that in the future we can be practiced. So, this is what this perspective means. According to their research, values really move the world, and the idea that values create our reality is also a very important approach when we try to destabilize misconceptions and prejudice in cross-cultural dialogues. Because it provides relativity to the idea of values. That is not something that necessarily sticks to one culture. As I said, here you have the summary that I just mentioned before, that values are energy, that we are moved by this energy, and that links us consciously and unconsciously to people and to circumstances. Values are choices, that we have the choice to decide and to prioritize, which also provides relativity to the idea that our values are different than other cultures' values. They come in clusters, and so it means that they are not necessarily fixed, and values are flexible. At the same time, they're all related. And then the important thing that I think it's the key to deconstruct misconceptions in intercultural dialogues is to understand that different people define the same value differently. We need to understand this and acknowledge this to avoid miscommunication, to avoid prejudice. But as critical thinkers, we always need to ask ourselves, where is the evidence? Where are the facts that back up a theory or a statement? In their case, their theory is supported by data that is collected through a values perspective survey online, that it's available in their website, kairos.com. And it's structured in a way that helps you identify core perspective and your top priority values. The survey is structured in a way that its questions help you to identify your values, your priority values, and your core value. And it's revealing that your values that you hold really drive the priorities that you set in your life. And it's also interesting to see in the results how the top values and the order of importance tend to be unique for each person, which it's very much linked to the ideas that we talked about before of values being linked together in clusters and been defined differently in different situations and by different people. The survey needs to be purchased for the amount of $40, but it's really worth it. I truly highly recommend it. And if not, reading the book, it also gives you a perspective of the results. The assessment, as I said before, it's organized in a way that asks you to choose between different values, and it requires about 45 minutes to complete. There are no right or wrong answers, and it really, the results that you get are intended to provide you with insights on how your life actually works, and also to put attention and energy for effective development for yourself. And also it's something that can be applied for organizations and companies too. As an example of the type of questions that the survey entails, they are trying to identify the four the main realms in which our values are organized, having to do with the realm of our family, the grounding, expansion, systems, relation, and management. I'll explain now what all these areas mean. And the idea is that a set of values that are inferred by the questions that you ask, such as integrity, respect, self-confidence, dialogue, responsibility, fairness, decisiveness, commitment, and development, how they are valued, and how you are how you link them together in the different areas. So one same value, how it is understood in terms of your family or in terms of your relation and or interactions, or in terms of your working environments. So the grounding section has to do with those values that help you to fulfill the most basic needs for you. They have to do with the necessary solid life foundation that we need to have a stable and balanced life. On the other hand, those values related to family have to do with social and kinship and emotional affiliation, and really are at the core of our relationship with others in the world. Then the area of management are those values that are linked to stability and being able to provide a legitimate structure for us to success. On the other hand, in success in different areas of our lives. Then the relational area of our lives are those values that are linked to the responsibility for the development of not only just one potential, but the awareness of the quality of relationship with others. The values that have to do with systems are those that address our interaction with dynamic groups, larger networks, and those that are beyond our individual scope, that have to do with our role in society as a citizen. And then finally, the section of expansion, which are values that guide our future, that help us to put our minds on a final aim or a goal, that have to do with aspirations and values, and also pulled us towards globally oriented visions. One of the activities that Charlie and Ken propose in their understanding and working with values perspective is a very useful activity to help us provide perspective and to deconstruct values as rigid categories and as categories that only apply to certain ethnic groups or cultural groups. So as students from one nationality, most of you, I would like you to please organize this set of values according to your priorities. These values are responsibility, meaning being accountable for people, a specific set of duties or a project. reconciliation, reestablishment of harmony, restoration of relationships between people or concepts which were previously in conflict, honesty, truthful expression of information, thoughts, and feelings, a strategy taking into account possibilities and alternatives when planning for the future, and trust. Be confident that one's positive expectations of others will be confirmed or be dependent on in like manner. So please take the time to organize this set of values, and then I would love to see your answers. The objective of this activity is, once we put them in common, is to visually realize that even though we can have a set of values we don't have in common, we don't have to prioritize or to view them in the same way and in the same order. The values perspective, it's been very useful in my own research and my own personal reflection about how to overcome misconceptions and prejudice in cross-cultural context, especially working in the One Asia Europe context. Over the years, I've been developing this theory, and I have just recently included a new line of research to enrich this alternative that is already proposed by Charlie and Kent about values being energy and being choices and behaviors and being clusters of meaning and meaning different things depending on different people and different circumstances. One of the things that I kept missing these years was the fact that there was not enough stress on how values are actually energy that links us together. Our core values and priorities that help us understand that there's much more than unite us than separate us. But of course, as critical thinkers, we always need to provide evidence and data and facts to support our claims. And this is the reason why I have just recently started a research project trying to collect answers from people from different nationalities. I just started, so what I'm going to present to you is just only from 5 nationalities. And the objective is try to investigate if the 3 most important things in our lives are similar or are completely different. Because if the most important things in our lives are our most important priorities are similar, that would also be evidence that values is also a way in intercultural dialogues, especially, to help us find common ground and help us fight against prejudice and misconceptions and misunderstandings against different nationalities and cultures. So I am going to present to you this project that is called in an interrogation mark, in a question mark. What unites us is more important than separate us. And what I ask the participants to please visually articulate are the 3 most important priorities in their life. As I said, I've just started and I would like to collect as much data as possible throughout the next year. So hopefully I will be able to provide more evidence. But as you will see now in this video mini clip, it just points at the evidence that there are actually some values that are really, really important to different nationalities. Have a look.
Hi, my name is Urso. I'm from Spain, and the 3 most important things in my life are my friends, my family, and my freedom.
My name is Anastasia. I'm from Ukraine, but currently I live in Spain. The three most important things for me in life are to be honest, not only with the people around you, but also with yourself, love, to express love to everyone, and also my friends and family. Всем желаю хорошего дня. Пока.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm British Irish, although I've lived in Spain for 17 years, so quite a few years of my life I've been away from my home country. The three things that are most important to me, friends and family are really important, but the idea of trying to do the right thing by them and being the best that I can for those people. Secondly, and actually, firstly, really, it should be my role as a parent. I've got two daughters, and that's changed everything. Thirdly, I've got a strong work ethic, and that's important to me that I do as best as I can in my job.
Hi, my name is Kwambi. I'm from Bolivia. The three things most important for me is my family, love, respect, and be healthy.
Hello, my name is Mateusz, and I'd like to tell you, I'm a university lecturer, an English lecturer, and I'd like to tell you what the three most important things in my life are. So the first most important thing in my life is obviously the people, my loved ones, the love and kindness that I can share with them. The second I would say is peace. Peace, meaning my inner peace and also outer peace. And the third very important thing for me would be knowledge and passion for learning, constantly learning new things. Thank you very much. It was very nice speaking to you.
So I hope you have liked and you more or less understand what I'm trying to demonstrate. Where maybe I find revealing discoveries along the way, but as I was saying, these examples point at the evidence that their values should also be viewed as something that unites us and something that shows us that what we have in common is greater than what differentiates us. If you're interested in participating in our project, please contact. I would like to reflect now on the concept of racism and how to use critical thinking skills to overcome racial prejudice and misconceptions around the concept of races, understood as human division and human classification of races. This is an essential and a necessary insight if we really want to promote the three principles and the three main values of the One Asia community, now Eurasia community, which are being able to go beyond nationality, being able to go beyond faith or religion, and no involvement in politics, which means to be able to graduate in cross-cultural dialogues, to be solid and respectful from the barriers of the self, from the frontiers and barriers of companies and organizations, and from the frontiers among countries. As critical thinkers, we always need to look at the evidence. And when you Google the word and the concept of racist, interestingly enough, you find 395 million results, which is an evidence that it's truly a very popular concept and it's in widespread use. When you display the images associated with the word racist, you see that all of them point at a classification, a division, categorization, and is highly visible at the same time. The contradiction implied in the very concept, because you find associated to races ideas and definitions such as ethnicity, which in itself is a different concept. You find the idea that we're talking about mixed, it's clear the classification that I mentioned before, but it's also interesting to see that races is linked to the idea of holding hands. However, again, what's more recurrent is this division and classification being different, pointing at the difference stemming from our different skin tones. And again, we finish with the contradiction of ethnic groups, which is in itself a completely different concept than racial and racist. It's interesting to see that the last word they use is collage, which it really summarizes what we find associated to races. So, as a contradiction that is displayed, and as critical thinkers, we need to always question where is the evidence that supports this claim in order to understand and to distinguish what is true and what is not, and also coming from reliable sources. So, again, as critical thinkers, we always need to analyze and evaluate the evidence. And when we look sadly at racism and racial prejudice, we can see that it still permeates cross-cultural conversations inside and outside national borders, is still in the 21st century. As clear example of a world leader that continuously reinforces racial prejudice, let's have a look at the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his long-standing history of racist comments and behaviors. Here you have a snapshot from a headline in the New York Times, in which it remembers how it was in the 4th season of The Apprentice. Apprentice is a TV show program that judges the business skills of a group of contestants. And here, the headline, it spotlights this strategy of Donald Trump as using race as to bolster ratings in the TV show. His idea, simple if explosive, is pitting an all-white team against all-black team. He was also accused by government investigators in the 1970s of refusing to rent apartments to black tenants. He denied it, but he settled the case. And also he made a name for himself in the 1980s by championing the return of the death penalty when 5 black, Hispanic and Hispanic teenagers were charged with raping a jogger. So he became a national vocal defender of the death penalty, just to make sure blacks and Hispanics get the record straight and they get enough punishment. Of course, not of course, in this particular case, the teenagers were found innocent and they were later exonerated. Also, taking on competitors in his Atlantic City casinos, he questioned whether rival owners were really Native Americans entitled to federal recognition, even though he later teamed up with another tribe in Atlantic City when money was to be made. And also when, with his eyes on the White House, he opened a years-long drive to convince American citizens that the President Barack Obama was really born in Africa. His own presidential campaign in 2016 was marked by slurs and insults against Mexicans. As we can see here, there was a series of tweets. He's very popular, as you all know, by his tweets. And so, just to read you a few. In 2013, so before his campaign, he was tweeting, "Sadly, the overwhelming amount of violent crime in our major cities is committed by blacks and Hispanics. A tough matter must be discussed." As you will see, and as critical thinkers, I want you to please observe that he never provides any evidence coming from reliable sources to support his claims. He never points at any evidence that backs this up. Another example, in a year later, in 2014, he was tweeting that when will the US stop sending dollars to our enemies? Example, Mexican and others. So he's really articulating a very divisive and a very aggressive racial tone. Also by describing Mexico and others as enemies of the United States. Following, the Mexican legal system is corrupt, so he always talks in totalizing and big categorizations, generalizing, but again, never providing any proof, any updated report, any data, any figures. It's just a smoke, really, because if we don't provide evidence, there is no solid argument, there is no objective affirmation. But still, that's a valid claim and a statement that a lot of US citizens validate and follow, and the outcome of the presidential election as himself in the president of the United States really proves that. So, as I was saying, he's using generalizing terms by saying that the Mexico legal system is corrupt as much as it's Mexico. Pay me the money that is on me now and stop sending criminals over our border. So again, always reducing Mexican immigrants in the border as criminals, never looking at them as humanitarian crisis, at families in need. They're always criminals. And again, no critical thinking approach to anything that he says, no evidence, no reliable sources to support anything. Then he fires up against Mexico by saying that, and that's in the 2015, Mexico court system corrupt. I want nothing to do with Mexico, or other than to build an impenetrable wall and stop them from ripping off US. Also, I would like to reflect on what I was mentioning before about how to promote the Eurasia Foundation principles to build cross-cultural dialogues and to be able to go beyond nationality and be able to break these walls that separate us. And here we have, in 2015, US, at the same time, at that time was a presidential candidate, but you find, which he's now US president, building impenetrable walls within world scenarios. The border is wide open for cartels and terrorists. Again, he keeps reducing Mexican immigrants as terrorists and as criminals without no evidence to support this. Secure our border, build a massive wall. So again, he's not talking about an impenetrable wall. He wants a massive wall. And of course, the Mexicans pay for that. Moreover, we find his famous travel ban as an attempt to ban, generally speaking, Muslims from entering the US, that originally included 6 countries: Syria, Iran, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, together with North Korea and Venezuela. And very recently, ignoring popular demonstrations and protests, he has just included more countries on his ban list, such as Nigeria, Eritrea, Tanzania, Sudan, and Burma. Just recently as July last year, he continued to fire up and provide this firestorm in the US Congress scenario by telling 4 Democratic Congresswomen of color to, quote, go back to their countries, unquote, even though 3 of them were born in the United States and and all of them are US citizens. In his tweets, he articulated how so interesting to see, quote, progressive unquote, Democratic congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the American people, the people of the United States, the greatest and most great powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how. So sadly, we can see how this president of the United States still use these very aggressive racial tones to pitting Americans against each other. Also, never provides any evidence to support any of the claims. He's always talking in generalizing terms. And of course, he is ignoring the history of the United States as a country of immigrants, his family being immigrants himself. Finally, I would like to reflect on the fact that Mr. Trump has never openly or strongly denounced white supremacist conflicts that have happened in the last years in the United States. On the contrary, he has a tendency to remain neutral and to equal both sides, alleging that, quote, there are intelligent people in both sides. And again, trying to promote democratic values, trying to go beyond the barriers of nationality and superiority and inferiority. Having a US president that continuously reinforces and fires up these racial tensions and these racial lines, it's really eroding and it's really against democratic values and against the possibility of providing a solid and a respectful cross-cultural dialogue between the West and the East. As critical thinkers, we need to always ask ourselves within these world scenarios, what is really separating us from them? What is really articulating this rigid separation of groups and of classification and division among us? And as we're going to see at the evidence and as we have seen so far, it is in the concept of race that we can find an answer of what is really separating one group from another group. So as we have seen through all the examples that I've just provided, we can affirm that race is perceived as a social construct. And as we look back at the first decades of the 21st century, we cannot be struck by the expansiveness of this cultural aggression and how this division between we versus they, I versus you, is still valid and is still very much used. So as critical thinkers, we need to ask where all this bigotry and hate comes from, where this mentality of superiority and inferiority, this classification, this division. And in order to help us understand and to unravel what is behind this division, I would recommend the work of B.F. Skinner, Contingencies of Reinforcement, in which he reflects about the dichotomy between the familiar and the unfamiliar, the tag of the familiar and the pull of the unfamiliar have fired the imagination and fashioned the conduct and the behavior of women and men across many centuries and many cultures. In the familiar, there is reassurance, whereas in the unfamiliar, there is uneasiness. And it is in this familiarity and unfamiliarity where concepts such as race, nationality, reassure and unsettle. And through these concepts such as races, there are contingencies of reinforcement. We shape the personalities and we mold our characters. And again, through culture and through cultural manifestations, political and social manifestations, all these divisions are getting reinforced, as in the example of Donald Trump. And again, looking for the evidence to support these claims, and looking for reliable sources that can help us to provide objective picture of where all these racial prejudice comes from. We can have a look at how race is being articulated through historical evidence. And of course, this is a very broad topic and it's in itself a lecture in itself, but I'm just going to provide very, very summarized important hints to understand my point here. So for example, it is in the work of, here I'll provide you the sources also for Skinner. So it's in the work of Martin Bernal and Race in History, that he points at the reflection that, race and modern racism, as we know, it really has its roots in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, especially in the West. However, modern racism as we know it does not originally come from the 15th century. Even though before the 15th century, it was what it was called racial prejudice. So in order to back up his theory, he demonstrates that it is prior to 500 before Christ, especially in examples of Greek and Hebrew texts from the Old Testament, where we can see that particularly in the expert of the Song of Songs and what is called also the Song of Solomon or the Canticles, we see that when they describe the erotic lover, it expressed not a sense of superiority or inferiority, but it expressed an aesthetic quality. So it is described as black and beautiful. However, these sentiments concerning race in the ancient world, according to Martin Bernal, starts to change around 500 before Christ, because he's now looking at the New Testament, the very same expert, but in the New Testament. And sorry, it's not Greek and Hebrew. I'm talking now about the Latin, the vernacular Latin Vulgate translation. We can see that it is changed from black and beautiful to black but beautiful. So black and beautiful gave way to black and beautiful as due to the influence of Christianity, the color of evil is and the complexion of evil is associated with black, whereas white is associated with purity and godness. So we can say that it's around the New Testament when there is this change from aesthetic quality to racial prejudice of inferiority or superiority. It is not until scientific discoveries, as we're going to see, and advances in DNA, that we can provide an objective justification to this theories. But before scientific discoveries, non-scientific ideas were in wide currency. And we can see one example on the theory that the black race descends from one of Noah's sons, which is Ham, and this is found in some Bibles, such as the Hebrew Bible in Genesis 10. And ancient racial prejudices found scientific validation and scientific systematization, starting with the work of Carl Linné. He was a Swedish biologist, and as Linda Vigeland points out in her article Race in History, he is the first recorded evidence of scientific classification of humans by color. And so he classified humanity by color, but also listed through his Sistema Naturale a group of personality traits, personality features. And along with these classificatory schemes, he arrived to the concept of a great chain of being, upon which all organisms could be arrayed in order of their proximity to heaven. And interestingly enough, Caucasians occupy the topmost human run. And with his work in 1758, we can objectively claim that scientific racism was firmly established by the mid-18th century in Western academia. Also, it's important to remember the work of Arthur de Gobineau in 1820, and he was a French aristocrat that was famous for helping to legitimize racism by the use of scientific racist theory and his racial demography standpoint. And he also developed the theory of the Aryan master race. So the racial myth that led directly to the genocide of the World War II had its origins in these mid-1800s, and also scientific theories, and also in the works of Arthur de Gobineau and others. These writers promoted the myth in which everything of value in human history could be attributed to the white race, and particularly its imaginary Aryan branch. This Aryan population was granted both superior physical and mental capabilities, and was naturally suited to lead the world. Let's remember that Hitler modified these ideas already in existence to create a justification for his own tyrannies and for the genocide against the Jewish. It is beyond the scope of this lecture to analyze in depth the many theories that have been articulated throughout history in science to validate this theory of one race superiority over another. But now, in the 21st century, with the advances of DNA technology and DNA sequence, we can claim as critical thinkers that we can now have an objective and solid evidence to demonstrate if this theory of superiority is valid or is unsustainable. So my question as critical thinkers now is this division of races scientifically sustainable? So we have to look at how science has been validated or revoking this theory. So first, let's have a look at the first scientific journal that proclaimed that race had no scientific basis in biology, and it was in 1995 in the Malwiki Journal that we find this claim for the very first time. Here, I can read an extract of the article that proclaimed that race is a result of the human tendency to categorize, but has no biological basis. In this article is mentioned Richard C. Lewontin theory that it was articulated in 1972 that demonstrated that actually the greatest amount of genetic variability is found within one race, not between races. Again, is beyond the scope to look at the categorization of ethnicity and race, but ethnicity links cultural features and traditions and groups them in different cultural regions. And in this sense, ethnicity is much more validated to talk about variability than races. So as critical thinkers looking for objective and reliable information, we necessarily need to have a look at Human Genomic Project results. This has been an ambitious project, an international project that has covered a range of 30-year span and has mapped our genetic fabric, our DNA sequence, our human sequence variation, gene identification, and model organisms. The finished sequence produced by the Human Genome Project covers about 99% of the human genome's gene containing regions, and it has been sequenced to an accuracy of 99%. Coupled with that, we have the Human Genome Diversity Project that supports human variation data. And this is an effort by anthropologists, genetics, doctors, linguistics, and other scholars from around the world to document the genetic variation of the human species worldwide. So this scientific endeavor is designed to collect information on human genome and variation to help us understand the genetic makeup of all our humanity, not just some of its parts, not just geographic parts. So the information is used to learn about human biology, history, the biological relationships among different human groups, and it's also useful in understanding the causes of and determining the treatment of particular human diseases. This diversity project is an important enterprise because all human groups seems to be interested in our origins and finding scientific evidence to our origins. So the information of this project gathers data that helps clarify the history of specific human populations and our species as a whole. So the frequencies of different variations in different populations can reveal how recently they shared a large pool of common ancestors. Those frequencies can be used to see if, for example, the Irish are more closely related to the Spaniards or Northern Europeans. In understanding our common ancestry, and within this Human Variation Genomic Project, it's important to understand that the molecular variation in human species is found in the mitochondrial DNA. And this is a small genome that is separated from our chromosomes. So mitochondria are organelles responsible for energy cells and for containing they have their own DNA. So mitochondrial DNA is useful in terms of evolutionary studies, in part because its rapid rate of evolution and also because it has an unusual mode of inheritance. So in terms of evolution, it evolves at a rate of about 2-4% per million years. So it's 5 to 10 times more quickly than a single copy nuclear DNA. And this enables scientists to obtain data about human events in human history that, in terms of evolutionary time, are actually very recent. So mitochondrial DNA has an unusual mode of inheritance. It is transmitted only strictly by the maternal line, as we can see in this figure, without a contribution from the male parent, as is in the case for the rest of all our genes. And again, this is useful for evolutionary studies because scientists can look at a variation in people today and they can trace a maternal family tree of the past. So when a large number of individuals of different worldwide origin are studied, inferences about human evolution may be made. So this is interesting to see that evidence from this DNA data proves that individuals are not all grouped according to geographic origin, which completely breaks the idea and the theory of human races. However, as I say, they are not grouped by according origin due to the retention of genetic changes occurring in the past. And also it's interesting to see that the results point that there is a tendency to find mitochondrial DNA from Africa at the end of all the family trees. Which this means is that the mitochondrial ancestors is linked to all of us by a distance of only 1,000 generations, and actually points to the fact that there were subsequent migrations out of Africa, and all our ethnic racial characteristics have developed in a relatively short space of time. Continuing with our critical thinking mindset, now we've seen that the science and DNA technology demonstrates that the distinction among human races is not biologically sustainable. But let's have a look now at how world institutions are promoting this division, or are fighting against this division through official statements. And I would like to have a look at United Nations statements, as it's been one of the international organizations that has been widely articulating the race question, and through different statements about issues of race. The first one, it was issued on the 18th of July 1950, following World War II and Nazi racism, and it was intended to clarify what was scientifically known about race at that time, and also as a moral condemnation of racism. And this statement, as we're going to see, has been modified over the years in different statements till reaching the Human Declaration of Human Rights by United Nations. So in this first statement by UNESCO in July 1950, in the first of its clauses, says that scientists have reached general agreement in recognizing that mankind is one, that all men belong to the same species. It's important to point that at this time, gender perspective is not taken into account, and mankind is understood as humankind, and man is understood as humans. And in the second clause of this statement, it reinforces this by saying that from the biological standpoint, the species Homo sapiens is made up of a number of populations. Each of one differs from the others in the frequency of one or more genes. So these first statements reinforce the evidence of science. In 1951, 1 year later, this statement was modified and rectified through the statement on the nature of race and race differences. I would like to point at the fact that even though statements reflect that race is not a biological category, it still is using race linguistically to refer to ethnic relations. And that's an important factor to bear in mind, how there is this contradiction between the statements and the way we rephrase these statements, because this, in a way, is a contradiction. Let's have a look at what it says. Here it says that the chief conclusions of the first statement are sustained in this second revision, and there was no delay or hesitation or lack of unanimity in reaching the primary conclusion that there were no scientific grounds whatever for the racial position regarding purity of race and the hierarchy of inferior and superior races to which this leads. So, as we see, again, it reinforces the fact that race is not a biological category, even though linguistically it still refers to it as such. Just to finalize with this revision of worldwide institutions that deal with issues about race or ethnicity, we have to necessarily have a look at the Declaration of Human Rights issued in 1963. That it's phrased as a United Nations Declaration on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Against racial is not used in inverted commas, and linguistically it reinforces this idea of racial divisions. In the General Assembly statement, they provide a clear articulation of this contradiction that I'm telling you about. On the one hand, it embraces dignity and equality of all human beings and promotes cooperation, eliminating distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So again, there is a contradiction of the human beings as a human race and categorization due to race. The same in the following paragraph, considering that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal, without distinction of any kind, in particular as to race. So it continues this contradiction between acknowledging that it's not a biological category, that it has no scientific validation and is not sustainable. However, linguistically, we still refer to this as race category instead of ethnic category, which science points as a more accurate way to refer it. So, as we have seen, being critical thinkers, looking for contrasted opinion coming from reliable sources of information, objectively proves that scientific evidence and facts coming from these reliable sources, such as the Genomic Project or Genomic Diversity Project, demonstrate that the division among races is scientifically unsustainable. Humanity is made up by ethnic groups, not races, and science proves that. Nevertheless, as we have seen, how worldwide organizations such as UNESCO, United Nations, even though they back up science by recognizing that race is not a biological evidence of division, they linguistically contradict science by denouncing this exclusion by race instead of by ethnicity. As the last practical activity of this section, I would like to share with you my own scientific investigation about my ancestors and their ethnicities. In one of the leading DNA testing platforms nowadays, that is called myheritage.com, the places our ancestors called home are encoded in our DNA, and the ethnic groups that historically come from same geographic regions are reflected in this gene pool. And when you analyze your DNA, these testing platforms will help you to determine which portions of your ancestor are estimated to originate from each of 4 supported ethnicities. As you all know, I am from Spain. I am from the north of Spain, where we are Celtic. So some of the results that I'm going to share with you were not as surprising or as predictable as the others that I've received. So yes, I am 91% European, which means that I am Iberian as a 46%. I'm Italian in a 19%. And as I say, I know I am Celtic. So 25%, almost 26% comes from North and West Europe. My ancestors are related to Irish, Scottish, and Wales in 13.5%, and also from the North and West European regions, 12%. What I did not know is that I was 5.7% African. I did not know that my ancestors came from Northern Africa in a 4.7%, what it will be the region of Egypt, Algeria, and also in a 1%, my ancestors originally come from Nigeria, which really validates this theory that I told you before about the mitochondrial DNA that tends to have at the bottom of its family tree origins from Africa. What I also did not know is that I was 2.2% from the Middle East, from this area of Turkey, Iran, and also I did not know that I was 1.1% American, coming from Central and South America. So my DNA test proves that I have 8 different ethnicities, that my ancestors came from 8 different ethnic groups. This really demonstrates that there is no pure race and that there is no pure category as being a Spaniard, since we all are mixed, and there is no better objective demonstration than this DNA test. This is very revealing and very personal, and it really triggers a lot of different emotions. But apart from the emotion, it really brings this objective scientific evidence that we are all mixed, but not as races, as ethnicities. I highly recommend you to take a DNA test. I highly recommend world leaders as Donald Trump or anyone who is affirming any racist lines and is spreading division on the basis of human races. I think this would be a very objective and scientific way to fight against racism if widespread its use. To finish this presentation, and as critical thinkers, it has been demonstrated that race, now between inverted commas, because it's not a biological phenomenon, it is a social phenomena that it has been transmuted by culture into a biological one. This is what the objective evidence in science tells us. As a finishing quote, and wrapping up all the reflections that I've been giving to you in this more practical approach, looking at the evidence and looking at the reliable sources, I would like to finish with a statement from L.C. Dunn, that it was published in the UNESCO in the section Race and Biology. He says, "We know now why certain views about race, uniformity, and purity and the fixity of racial differences were and are wrong, and why social and political views of race inequality were and are wrong. Since the former were used as a justification for the latter, we should as reasonable beings like to believe that if we get rid of our biological misconceptions, we should thereby cure the social and political ills of injustice and exploitation, which appear to be based upon wrong biology. Eventually, we may expect this to happen, but we should not forget that the way in which human beings and individuals and as groups have acted with regard to race differences has more often stemmed from feelings and from prejudice than from knowledge." So, thank you very much for your time and your interest. I hope you have found it useful in understanding how critical thinking can help us to overcome prejudice and misconceptions in cross-cultural dialogues when it comes to racism and when it comes to claims that our values as groups are different, by demonstrating, first of all, that values are choices as much as they're energy, and they are defined differently. Also, as the research project that I presented to you, I also would like to demonstrate that values are an energy that unites us all. And with regards to race, how it's not a biological phenomenon, that it's really, as it says here, a feeling of prejudice that comes from ignorance, and it lacks scientific objective evidence. Thank you very much again. I don't know if you have any questions or doubts. I will be very happily answering to you. And well, just to finish, my best regards from Spain. I hope all of you are safe and healthy in this coronavirus crisis that is affecting us worldwide. It's been a pleasure for me to share with you my thoughts and my research.